Welcome back on Crossroads. Newspapers across the country are taking on President Trump's attacks on the media, what he calls fake news.
About 350 papers, big and small, devoted their editorials to the rights of a free press. The Boston Globe set this campaign in motion.
The paper's editorial board, writing, for more than 2 centuries, this foundational American principle has protected journalists at home and served as a model for free nations abroad. Today it is under serious threat, adding it sends an alarming signal to despots from Ankara to Moscow, Beijing to Baghdad that journalists can be treated as a domestic enemy.
And here's how the president responded on Twitter. He said the Boston Globe is in collusion with other papers on free press, and then later tweeted, "The press is free to write and say anything it wants, but much of what it says is fake news, pushing a political agenda, or just plain trying to hurt people." Let's talk about this with Congressman Ted Lieu from California. Congressman, thank you for coming on our show this evening. How did we get to this point where hundreds of newspapers have to come out and say, we are not the enemy?
Thank you for your question. I note that the press is the only profession in the United States Constitution that is protected. And framers of the Constitution were very smart because they knew there would be periods of time when government officials would try to suppress the press. And because of what we're seeing now, we're seeing attacks on the press. You have now the press fighting back. And I think this is healthy for democracy. And for countries like Israel and the United States, having dissenting opinions is one of the hallmarks of democracy. It's what makes our nations strong.
Congressman, we would like to shift the conversation with you because we know that today you put the Yemen war, the conflict in Yemen, on the spotlight. And around 40 children died last week in airstrikes on a school bus carried by the Saudi-led coalition. And you demand an investigation into the events. Tell us, what does the U.S. have to do with it? Why are you calling to investigate it?
Sure. The United States is supporting the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. I have no problems with the United States supporting allies such as Saudi Arabia. I have no problems with us trying to push back against Iran and the Houthis. What I have a problem with are the multiple airstrikes by this Saudi-led coalition that have hit hospitals, schools, weddings, funerals, and now a school bus with 40 children. Those look like war crimes to me.
Congressman, just recently, a couple of senators tried to push through a bill to stop U.S. support to the Saudis. That failed. How confident are you that you will be heard?
So I wrote a letter to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense because there are U.S. laws as well as the UCMJ and the law of armed conflict that prevent U.S. personnel from assisting or aiding in war crimes. I formerly served an active duty in the Air Force. I taught the law of armed conflict as one of my duties, and it looks to me that we may have U.S. personnel that may be liable, and that's why I'm having the Inspector General investigate. And in America, the Inspector General's offices have a large amount of independence, and I believe that they will do their job that they've been given.
Aren't you worried that calling for such an investigation might affect negatively the relationship of the U.S. with Saudi Arabia at a time when the Trump administration is trying by every means to counter Iran?
So I support efforts to counter Iran. I support assistance to Saudi Arabia in a numerous array of different areas. In the case of Yemen, my concern is the airstrikes that have hit civilians, many of them nowhere near military targets. And having taught the law of war, they look like war crimes. The United States should not be assisting in actions that are killing women and children. And it's also used as a recruiting tool to recruit more terrorists. It ends up also harming the national security of the United States.
Congressman, the support of the Saudis in Yemen goes back to the Obama administration. Why weren't more lawmakers speaking up back then?
Well, I was, and so I also criticized the Obama administration for aiding the Saudi-led coalition at the time when they were also doing numerous airstrikes that struck civilians, again, at weddings and funerals and other places. And we were able to get the Obama administration to stop a shipment of precision-guided munitions to Saudi-led coalition. And you might wonder, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we want to give the coalition more accurate weapons? And because it turns out that it's not that they're missing their targets. They're actually intending to strike them. So, for example, in the case of a large funeral, they hit that funeral, killed hundreds of civilians, injured hundreds of others, and then they hit the same funeral again. And they precisely struck that target. So our concern is by giving the coalition these weapons, we're actually causing more harm to civilians, not less.
I just want to say that the statement by the Saudi-led coalition, they first said that the strike was legitimate. They do not target civilians, but specific targets. Do you believe, are you convinced that an investigation into the events will show otherwise?
First of all, there absolutely needs to be an independent investigation. I'm pleased the United States has actually sent a 3-star general to Saudi Arabia to be involved in that investigation. We know from public reporting that the Saudis intentionally struck that bus because they believe there were 2 Houthis on that school bus, 2 Houthi leaders. But if they knew there were also children on that bus, then that would, in fact, be a war crime because it would be way out of proportion to the expected military gain, and you simply can't take that kind of action when you know there's 40 children on board.
Well, Congressman, we know this is an issue very important to you. We hope more people pay attention because this conflict needs that attention. Congressman Ted Lieu of California, thanks for coming on our show.
Thank you.
Right, Shayna, the war in Yemen very rarely gets, center stage here in, on American media even, I would say, or...
It should get a lot more, considering the United States is aiding Saudi Arabia and civilians. Tens of thousands of people are dying there.
It's also the UK and France, not only the United States supporting this or providing logistics to the Saudi-led coalition.
But we are in the United States.
I agree. All right. Moving on. President Trump held a 2-hour-long cabinet meeting at the White House. The discussion reportedly included the possibility of new sanctions on Turkey, China trade, and the opioid epidemic.
The president ignored reporters' questions about his former aide Omarosa Manigault-Newman. She is making the TV rounds with a new book and more secret recordings of the president and high-ranking White House officials. The president also did not answer questions about the revoking of former CIA Director John Brennan's security clearance.
Brennan has been an outspoken critic of the president, and now both sides of the aisle are weighing in. Correspondent Emily Rao has details.
It's pretty clear this is a president who goes out of his way to punish his political adversaries.
Democrats quick to blast the president for pulling the security clearance of former CIA Director John Brennan.
I just think this is sad if it's gotten down to where politics has come to this level.
Republican Senator Susan Collins also critical, but adding,
and I believe that John Brennan has acted in far too politically a role since he left the CIA. Nevertheless, I do not see the grounds for revoking his security clearance.
Farther right, Senator Lindsey Graham backing up the president.
Mr. Brennan has gone way over the line in my view, and I think restricting his clearance, pulling his clearance makes sense to me.
Nearly 4.1 million Americans have security clearances, including 1.3 million with top secret clearance.
What they've done by revoking his clearance is they've taken that resource away, and that could be harmful from a national security perspective.
John Cohen says there's reason to worry. Over the course of his 32-year career, Cohen has held the highest security clearance, and he maintains a clearance today.
There are people who are former and well-respected leaders of our intelligence community who are so concerned at the threat facing the United States that they are raising the alarm in a very public way.
That was Emily Rao reporting. Let's talk about this with our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. Dan, are other Obama-era officials afraid that they're going to be losing their security clearances as well? And why does it matter?
Already has listed some of those names. For instance, Michael Hayden, who also used to be head of the CIA. And Hayden is responding that this could intimidate people who now work in intelligence agencies because they might fear that if they tell the White House the truth about some situation in the world, it might get Donald Trump angry, and that could hurt their careers. That's why Michael Hayden says this could be damaging to what goes on now. When it comes to the individuals like Michael Hayden, or the White House has even named James Comey Comey, who was fired as FBI director last year. It's hard to see how that has any real effect. Traditionally, why do they keep security clearance? So the current office holders, say in the CIA, could call Brennan or Hayden and ask their advice, and it's okay to talk about secure things. What's the chance the Trump administration would call any of those former officials? Almost nil. So the White House, for now, has punished John Brennan, and if that goes over okay, despite all the criticism, yeah, one has to expect President Trump will do it to other former officials, too. Shana and Tal.
And Dan, what's new at the Paul Manafort trial? This was the first day of jury deliberations?
Yes, and so we don't know exactly what the jury did, except at the end of the day, they passed 4 questions to the judge, written questions. You know, he only answered one of them, which was, please define what is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And the judge said what judges always say, that it doesn't have to be absolutely no doubt, but whatever a reasonable person would feel. What about the other specific questions about tax evasion and foreign bank accounts? The judge told the jury, you heard the case in court. Figure it out yourself. There are 18 federal charges. So one day of deliberations is over. There's a lot here that's complex. We don't know how long it may take. Shana and Tal?
Well, we might have that conversation tomorrow if it's all over then. Dan Raviv, thank you so much.
All right, next on Crossroads, China rocked by scandal. Faulty vaccines threaten potentially hundreds of thousands of children. We'll tell you what the government plans to do.
And in Israel, the annual light show that just might leave you speechless. We'll tell you about the cosmic phenomenon when we come back.